Well, should we get started? Okay, fabulous. Um, I apologize. My camera is not working. I guess that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but at least my audio is working. So it's a pleasure to be with you here today for the Faith in Action 2020 Suicide Prevention Summit for Faith Leaders. This is our first session of several. Obviously, with the current state of COVID, everything's been changed in so many of our worlds, and so we'll be doing this summit virtually this year. Hopefully, we'll be back together in person next year. So, by way of introduction, I am Representative Steve Elison. I serve in the Utah House of Representatives, currently in my 10th year, and have worked a lot in the area of suicide prevention, and so much appreciate the efforts that so many people, including faith leaders, have made to focus on this issue to help save lives. I think that faith leaders play an essential role in suicide prevention. Just a quick story. Because I have had the opportunity to attend meetings like this before and learn basic skills, when I was in a leadership position in my faith, one day I was had an opportunity to meet with a member of our congregation, and we were discussing kind of just some set things. And partway through that interview, I just felt prompted that something wasn't right with this this sister, this lady that I was visiting with. And I said, can we just stop our kind of formal conversation, and can I ask you some other questions? And she said, sure. So I used some of the QPR, question, persuade, refer skills that I have learned, and asked her about, how she was feeling, and she shared she was depressed. And then I asked about thoughts of suicide, which she had been considering. And then I asked about, kind of how serious she'd been thinking about that. And she shared some details that I knew it was very serious and potentially imminent. And, if I had not had that training, I'm sure I probably would have said the wrong things. I probably wouldn't even asked about it, actually. But I was able to share some basic things with her, talk about short-term coping strategies, and then was able to refer her to a local psychiatrist and get her the help she needed. Months later, at a social event at our church, she introduced me to her husband and introduced me as her guardian angel, which I didn't feel worthy of that title, but it was a real revelation to me that how somebody that's in a position of leadership within their faith can, through basic skills and a desire to help people, be those eyes and ears of so many people that may be at risk. I think this summit is more important than ever with what we're dealing with COVID and the isolation that's going on. And I was speaking with a friend of mine in preparation for this, and I said, what would be one word of advice I could share with these faith leaders? And he said, with the mental health impacts of COVID, we just need so strongly to think about connection with the members of our congregations. And we kind of had worked up this analogy. You've heard of good, better, best. And in terms of communication, a text is good, a phone conversation is better, and a appropriately physically distanced but in-person visit may be best if it's if you can do that safely. And I'll just share one quick example that my wife did recently that I thought was a great example of this. She works with a young women's group in our congregation and had struggled to know how to reach out to people. And so she requisitioned a 16-foot trailer, put a bunch of lawn furniture on it, filled a cooler full of ice cream bars, and gathered a bunch of church leaders and went to each of and then she got a Bluetooth speaker, played the music of an ice cream truck, and went to each of these young women's homes and invited them out to, with masks on, of course, and select an ice cream, and then just visit with the different people at a safe distance, which I thought was a great example of a way to reach out, yet do it in a safe way. I actually had heard that an individual named Rupert Grint, who played Ron Weasley in Harry Potter, after he made his $50 million, went out and bought an ice cream truck and drove around giving away free ice cream. So I guess it wasn't a new idea, but I just challenge everybody to think about how they can reach out to people, and again, whatever method that is, any connection is going to be good. So again, thank you for being with us today and for your interest in saving lives. We will begin with an opening prayer. And we had to make a last-minute change. I believe that it's going to be Pastor Logan Wolf from the Crosspoint Church. Is that correct? Pastor, are you there?
Steve, he's going to be giving it at the end of the session.
Okay.
So we're turning the time over to our presenter.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'll just state our goal is that our today we hope that participants will come away understanding how to respond in a proactive and loving way to those at risk for suicide, contributing to a culture of safety and compassion within their local faith communities, and that we'll learn some simple strategies to provide hope for persons at risk of suicide, including the basics of lethal means reduction. So having said that, I believe I'm turning it over to Andrea Hood, who is the Project Aware Program Manager at the Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. And then after that, we'll have Heidi Peterson, the Program Manager at the Utah DSAMA. And then lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Marissa Henn, the Community Health Director at Intermountain Healthcare. Andrea.
This is actually Heidi Peterson, and we appreciate the introduction, Steve, and we're going to reverse that order just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and start out, followed by Andrea and Marissa Henn. So, Steve, thank you so much for that great introduction. I especially appreciate the personal story there, and one of my greatest passions and interests in suicide prevention is that it literally does enable us to be as that, so to speak, guardian angel, because we know that suicide is preventable. So we do appreciate everybody being here today for that motivation in saving lives. So as Steve said, my name is Heidi Peterson. I'm a program manager and regional director with the Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. And today we're going to be talking about what faith leaders need to know when it comes to preventing suicide. And we just want to point out here that the reason that we want to learn these things, of course, is so that then we can put them in action. The theme for our summit is faith in action. So we hope that as you take in this information that you will be thinking about ways that you can apply this to those that you know and care about that may be struggling with suicide ideation. So suicide prevention is my business, and about a decade ago is when I first began working with this professionally, but my introduction to this need came from a very personal place. At the time, one of my sons was a senior at Tooele High School, and that year at his school, there were 4 suicide deaths in one spring season. And I will never forget the first time he came home and told me that there had been somebody at his school that had died by suicide. My son was a senior class president, and he cared a lot about the students in the school, and this really had a personal effect on him. At the time, he didn't know who the student was. He just knew that somebody had been lost. And I watched him through the weekend, how this weighed heavily on him. At the time, I didn't have a lot of the training that I have now, so I did the best that I could as a mom to help him and to help put understanding and compassion into this. The following Monday, he went back to school and he went to his health class. And he came home even more heavy-hearted that day than he had on the Friday. And he said to me, he said, "Mom, I went to health class today and the chair in front of me was empty." And then he said, "Mom, it was her chair." And this was the chair of the young lady that had died by suicide. And that empty chair has come to symbolize a couple of really important things when it comes to suicide prevention. The first one is that when we lose somebody to suicide, we really cannot measure the impact that has. My son did not know this young lady very well, but he knew that he shared a classroom with her, he shared a hallway, and he shared a school with her. And it also brought on this sense of responsibility. And he found himself saying things like, "Mom, what if I would have known? What if I would have said something? Could I have done something to prevent this?" So it was with that incident that I realized that suicide prevention is everybody's business. Now, certainly we want to point out it wasn't my son's fault that we lost this young lady to suicide, but when we do know better and we know what to look for, that empowers us to do better. We can look for these signs, and certainly we know that acts of compassion and reaching out with confidence can certainly save lives. So we want to make sure that we're empowering you today to do that very thing. We want to talk a little bit about what's unique about addressing suicide within the faith community. And I want to ask first off, before we get in here, if you would, in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little hand sign there, but indicate in that chat box if you have been affected at all by this issue of suicide. Go ahead and figuratively raise your hand if you can in that chat box. Okay, I can see right away immediately we have 34, 35 climbing. Now, would we, if we had the chance to do this in person, and I've done this kind of presentation dozens and dozens of times, one of the most eye-opening things initially that I discovered about suicide prevention is that when you ask this question in a large group, the answers are almost unanimously that everybody's lives in some way or another has been negatively impacted about this issue of suicide. And within the faith community, we have a couple of unique things when we're dealing with suicide. What we know about when people join the faith community is that they are motivated there to gain a closer connection with God and to other people. And suicide ideation by its very nature makes people feel disconnected from who they are, from their purpose, from others, and from that connection to God. So it's really important that within a faith setting that we know how to handle this issue around suicide that can enhance or increase a person's ability to feel more connected, to somehow harness that hope that may be inside of them, and to increase that and to increase that connectedness that Representative Elison was talking to us about, you know, whether it be through an ice cream truck or by reaching out with a personal and very vulnerable conversation to increase the way that we are connecting. Because we know that when people come and don't feel that connection within their faith community, we can actually be increasing those feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. And on the opposite side of that, when we are increasing connection, we're going to be decreasing that risk for suicide. So that's super important. So we want you to consider, how prepared do you feel to talk about this issue of suicide within your faith community? I want you to just consider, maybe on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being super confident in addressing this, 1 maybe feeling a little bit of trepidation or fear around it. And consider that in 2 ways. 1 being to your congregation as a whole, and number 2, on having those one-on-one, very personal conversations. Some of you may have felt some resistance come up, and we want you to reflect as we're talking today about what are some of your personal resistance characteristics when it comes to talking about suicide. We hope to address some of those, and if you still find yourself feeling resistance after this training, feel free to reach out to us, because our objective is to empower you to have those skills so that we can bridge that gap and help people feel more connected and more protected within their faith congregation. This image right here is one of my favorite images when it comes to suicide prevention. I actually found this image when I was just browsing, surfing the net one day. And I don't know all of your immediate reaction, but when I saw this, my first reaction to it was a sense of alarm or fear. And, you know, you see this man here taking a nap with his hat on his head while there are sharks swimming around him. And of course, there is imminent danger here. And it made me want to, you know, figuratively, you know, yell into the computer here and say, wake up, like danger is approaching. And maybe we feel similar emotions when it comes to suicide. Maybe we see and feel, maybe our gut kind of senses that somebody is at risk for suicide, and we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to sound that alarm. Well, the longer I looked at this picture, I started to see this through different eyes. And I want all of you to consider, what if this man in the boat feels confident enough that even though there are sharks around him, that he has skills and tools that he is prepared with that give him the confidence and the calm that he can actually rest in the boat while there are sharks swimming around him. And so if you find yourself feeling alarmed and panicked about talking to somebody with suicide, we hope that by the time that you learn the skills we're going to present today, that we can increase that sense of confidence and calm so that you can address these conversations and feel empowered to help others with them. So when we talk about some of the resistance that might come up, we have some different words here that that may be associated with some of that resistance. You know, I always say that there's 2 kinds of topics in this world, and one is warm, fuzzy kind of topics, you know, like ice cream trucks, right? Representative Ellison and rainbows and that kind of thing. And then we have cold, prickly words. And suicide, we know, of course, is one of the hardest things to talk about. And some of these associated words can be similar. So there can be a lot of stigma and judgment, shame, embarrassment around this issue. So as we navigate through how we talk about suicide, we want to do all that we can to reduce stigma. Kind of a twin to stigma can be shame, especially within the faith community. And what we know is that faith really gives us a sense of our moral compass, And so it's not when we talk about shame that we're being accusatory of any particular religion, but we know that religion plays a role in protecting people when it comes to suicide, to giving them sense of connection, and to providing a moral compass. So when we're dealing with life and death and right and wrong, it's easy to make this a moral issue. But what we want to make sure is that we are making our natural response to be one of hope and connection instead of hope and instead of guilt and shame. This from shame researcher Brene Brown. She said, "I believe that if we want meaningful, lasting change, we need to get clear on the differences between shame and guilt and call for an end to shame as a tool for change." And next to that there, a quote that says, "Shame says that because I'm flawed, I'm unacceptable. Grace says that though I am flawed, I am cherished." And of course, we want to respond with feelings and words that are going to evoke feelings of hope and love and connection. So letting people be vulnerable in that space, that even in this imperfect or less than ideal state, that they can be loved and cherished and find hope in a new beginning. So we want to also help you understand what it may be like for a person that is experiencing suicide ideation, because there can be lots of misperception about that. It's important, first of all, to realize that people that are feeling suicidal, the desire really is not that they want to die, but more comes from a place that they really want this internal pain and pressure to end. I'm sure that all of us here on this call today have had an experience where we've just had a really, really bad day. And how many of us, when we have that really bad day, can't wait to go talk to a friend or a spouse or a close confidant. So imagine if you had this feeling of a really, really bad day times 100, and no matter what you did or who you talked to, that pain did not go away. And that's often what this feels like for people that are feeling the suicide ideation. Another person explained it to me as saying, imagine being in a car with mud on your windshield and you're locked inside. You have a great desire to get to your destination, but you're trapped inside and you can't get the mud off the windshield by just turning on the wipers or using some of those everyday techniques that we might use to help us feel better when we're down. So the thing I like about that analogy is that if there was mud on the windshield, there is a way to get that mud off, but it does require help from the outside. And so these skills do require us to grow an antenna, if you will, to kind of have this sixth sense of sensing when somebody may figuratively have mud on their windshield, so we can help them connect to the right resources to feel that hope again. It's important also to note that people that are feeling suicide ideation, they're often feeling great uncertainty about these feelings. They may be feeling some hope, and it is possible for us to reconnect them with that part of themselves. But most people that experience suicidal ideation and attempts do not actually die by suicide. And that can be an encouraging thing to remember too, that a lot more people feel and experience these things without actually attempting or ending their lives. I want to talk for just a few minutes about suicide risk factors. One of the things that we know we can do when we want to solve a problem is get closer to it. So looking at suicide risk factors, it's kind of like using a public health model. For example, for like an issue like a heart attack, we know that we can look at certain risk factors when it comes to heart disease, like poor diet or a sedentary lifestyle, and know that by doing the opposite, by eating better foods and having more exercise, that we can actually buffer against some of those risk factors. So we have three different categories of where we can find these risk factors. One is going to be in a sense of mental and physical health, the other in environment, and the third one in life experiences. Here are a few examples of these risk factors. On the right-hand side, we know that if a person has had prior suicide attempts, those people are at an increased risk, and we want to keep an extra close eye on them. If they are struggling with any kind of mood disorder or substance abuse, or if they have access to lethal means, those are some examples of increased risk. And of course, there are several others, but we want to underscore also that to buffer against some of that risk, we have what we would call protective factors. And we've already talked about connectedness quite a bit today, and we really want to highlight that anything that we do to help a person feel more connected to others and within the faith community to God, that it's going to increase that protection. Effective behavioral health care. We know when people get help, that most often when they do, that can help a person return to normal mental health, and that suicide ideation and those thoughts can come to an end. When they have contact with caregivers and appropriate problem-solving skills, all of these things can counteract what puts a person at risk for suicide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about warning signs. What is it that we're looking for if we think that a person may be at risk for suicide? And before we go into these specifically, I want to put this in context a little bit with an analogy that came from the author of QPR, Dr. Quintent. And he poses this question, talks about when he was younger collecting bugs in a mason jar. Maybe all of us have had that experience as a child or watched our kids where they put these bugs in a mason jar and poke a little hole at the top, put a little grass in there inside, and where they can observe these bugs. And he talks about his experience in observing these bugs and how over time a bug realizes that they're stuck and they are looking for a way to escape. So they find themselves crawling to the edge of the side of that jar, making their way up, and inevitably the pitch of that jar gets a little too much and they fall back down. They may struggle there for a little bit and then eventually flip themselves over and crawl to the side of the jar again. And that cycle could just go on all day long. And many of us, we might feel like that is a little bit of how life is, right? We climb, then we fall, and we get back up again. But he poses this question: what happens when a person loses their will to climb anymore? They just don't have the strength to climb. So I bring up that analogy because as we talk about some of these warning signs, some of these you may see a lot in people. And there's really no formula that if you have 5 warning signs, then for sure you're suicidal. In fact, I had one person I was training in a class. He says, you know what, I was feeling pretty good before, but I found that I have 10 of these warning signs. Am I suicidal? And so, of course, we know that it doesn't work like that. A person can be dealing with a lot of pressures in their life and still not be experiencing suicide ideation. 1 or 2 things for another person, given their life circumstances, may be enough to get them. So what we want to do is show you what some of these warning signs, but also put them in that emotional context. And if your gut is telling you that you feel like this person has weary legs to climb that wall of life anymore, listen to that instinct and ask yourself if there's some of these warning signs, and then have the courage to talk to them about it. So some of these verbal warning signs, if you hear them talking about ending their life, saying that they really don't see a reason to live anymore. If they're afraid of being a burden to others, we hear that often among our elderly population, which is one of the highest actually when it comes to suicide ideation and death. If a person talks about feeling trapped or that their emotional or physical pain is unbearable, those are things you want to look about or pay attention to. Sometimes these verbal clues can be very direct. A person might come right out and say, you know what, I've decided to take my life. I've decided to kill myself. They might say, I wish I were dead, or that they're going to commit suicide. Sometimes this is more coded, and they may say, you know, I'm not feeling like life is worth it. I'm just going to end it all. Or they may put a condition on it. Maybe among youth, we might hear a young man say, if after all of this work and preparation, I don't make the basketball team, I don't see any reason in going on anymore. Those would all be verbal clues that we want to pay attention to. Sometimes these can be even more indirect. That would sound like, you know, something like, I'm really tired of life. Now, I would guess that if we were in a room all together and we rose our hand, if we'd ever said that or felt like we're tired of life, that would probably be inclusive of all of us. But it also could be a sign if somebody is talking about, I'm tired of life. that if we take the time to dig a little deeper, there may be some suicidal intent there that we want to pay attention to. Some other examples of those indirect clues include my family would be better off without me. Who would really care if I died anyway? I just want out. You don't need to worry about me. I won't be around much longer. So again, we want to pay attention when we hear any verbal clue like that. Sometimes we get signs that are more behavioral. We mentioned this before, but if there's been any previous suicide attempts, we want to keep a special close eye on that. If a person has recently acquired a gun, or if they're stockpiling pills, and again, keep this in context. You know, I worked with a police officer, a female police officer, out here when we were doing suicide prevention, and she used to say, you know, if I went and bought a gun, it just might mean that it's payday. But if it were Heidi that went out and bought a gun, everybody should be really worried, because that's not my norm. So to keep those things in context of what you know about that person. There may be co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness. They may be putting personal affairs in order, and keep that in context for what that looks like at different stages of life. Typically, we think of putting personal affairs in order, maybe as legal documents, putting a will in place, that kind of thing. I asked a group of youth once what that looks like for them. What do they think putting their affairs in order looks like? You know, and I had one youth just respond and said, I would deep clean my room. Now, we don't want to be, you know, alarmed every time a teenager deep cleans their room. We hope that there are clean rooms for all of our kids. But again, the sense that a child to put their affairs in order might deep clean their room. This might be behavior that's out of the norm. And if that's paired with maybe giving away some of their prized possessions, along with some of these verbal clues, you can see how there would be an increased reason for concern there. If they have a sudden interest or disinterest in religion, this one can go either way. It could be that a person had never really been religious or attended church before, but now that they're thinking about death, that they have an increased curiosity about God and about faith. Or it could be that they have attended religious services and been very active in their faith, and then the sense of hopelessness is making them disconnect from that. So again, the real thing that we're watching for here is any sense of change. If there's an increased use of alcohol or drugs, or a relapse after a period of recovery, and this could be with any behavior that is not helpful for the person, a relapse into bad habits can be a sign or a reason to keep extra care of that person. Also, if there's unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability. But here again, we want to just emphasize that if you see a change in behavior, we had a youth in the community that I lived that actually his norm was being a little bit irritable, a little bit uptight. And there came a certain day that he came to work and his coworkers noticed like he was really at peace and he was happy. He seemed like he was in a better mood than ever before. And unfortunately, they'd lost that young man to suicide at the end of the week. So that one I always kind of call foul on. It doesn't seem fair that acting happy should be a sign for suicidality. But again, the real sign there was kind of this abrupt change in behavior. So we just want to clue into that and watch for some of those changes. Okay, sometimes these clues come to us more through situations. I refer to these as like life's whammies, right? And we all get them sooner or later, and we know that whammies don't often play fair. It's not like we get hit with one whammy before, you know, we get to address that whammy before life hits us with another one. I'm sure all of us have either been that person or know somebody that it seems like life throwing 5 or 6 whammies at a person at a time. So here's some examples, but there certainly are many, many more. Being fired from a job or expelled from school, a recent unwanted move, a loss of any major relationship, certainly a death of somebody that you're close to. Especially, we want to underscore if that death has been by suicide. If there's a diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, a sudden unexpected loss of freedom or a fear of punishment, an anticipated loss of financial security, even a loss of a cherished therapist, a counselor, a teacher, or fear of becoming a burden to others. And again, there could be several more there, but we want to really put into context what's happening in a person's life. Also watch for moods, and I alluded to this earlier, watch for abrupt changes. But where any of these moods are present, that can also serve as a warning sign for us. So to be most effective, and what we want to make sure all of you know that are here today, when we see these warning signs, and if our gut is telling us that that person may be thinking about suicide, most likely they are. And, you know, before I learned about suicide prevention, I think my go-to was kind of giving myself an out. I know I had a brother that was struggling, and I have to admit that I wondered at times if he was thinking about suicide. But the self-talk that went inside my head was maybe like, oh, okay, I'm worried about suicide. Well, I don't want to bring that up, because if I bring it up and he's not thinking about it, maybe I'll put an idea in his head, and I certainly don't want to be the one that's responsible for him making that decision. So when I did that, I was giving myself a nice little pass, letting myself think or believe that that was the best thing to do, to put my head in the sand, maybe dance around the issue a little bit, maybe do something nice for him and connect, but to not really get direct about this. Well, remember what we said at the beginning, you know, when we know better, we need to do better. And so all of us collectively here today have to understand that when we want to be the most effective at suicide prevention, it's always best to ask directly about suicidal intent. And it's okay if this sounds like a scary thing to do. I have to admit, when I first took my first suicide prevention training, every time I said suicide, I'd just like feel this little lump right there in my throat. It was hard to even get the word out. But just like with anything, the more we practice talking about this topic, the easier it will be. And the payoffs in being comfortable about it, I have to say from personal experience, are great. You know, people will come to really trust and to know that you care about them in a really in a way that increases their trust for you, and that can really be life-saving for them. So here are some examples about what that might look like. The most important thing to remember is that we're going to ask in a manner that shows that suicidal thoughts are common or understandable in their circumstances. So we don't want to do this with a lot of shock and awe, certainly not with any emotion that's going to arouse feelings of shame or that kind of thing. But we want to say things like, you know, sometimes people, when they're going through what you're going through, they feel like they don't want to live anymore, or sometimes they think about killing themselves. Have you been having thoughts like these? This might sound like, you know, I know that you said you're feeling like you can't handle it anymore. When you say that, do you mean that you're thinking about suicide? Another example. Recently, and this, by the way, is my favorite, because you can always throw it back on what you're learning today. You can say, hey, recently I attended a training, and based on what I learned, I just don't feel like I would be a good friend if I didn't ask you if you were having thoughts of suicide. So can you see with all of those examples that even though we're using that word, we're getting in there really directly, they don't sound in a way that they're putting a person in a place of judgment or shame. We want to avoid asking, let's say, let me give you an example of what we don't want to say. Anything that would sound like, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? Now, with the way that I just said that, is a person likely, first of all, to be honest about if they are thinking about suicide? Just the way it was asked shows that there may be some judgment there, and it's also showing what you're really hoping they will say, instead of leaving it open for somebody to be vulnerable and to open up and to let you know that yeah, they are having feelings of suicide. So when you get the question out, then what? What do we do when the answer is yes? And what we want to know, here are some good sample responses. We want to be, again, direct with them and sincere. You could say things like, thank you for being honest. I know that this can be hard to talk about. It might be, I'm glad you told me. I think I might be able to help. Or it sounds like you're in a lot of pain. I am so sorry that you're going through this. And I want to just share a brief personal story about when I had an opportunity to ask this question. And like I said, when I first had my first suicide prevention training, I was super intimidated by it. I could barely say that word suicide. And in the last decade, I can say that I've used these skills dozens of times. But the first time was probably the hardest time. And as I was going through my 2-day suicide prevention training, it occurred to me that my son that had been dealing with really severe depression and was away at college was probably at really high risk for suicide. And throughout the context of that day, I realized that I had a job to do when I got home, and that was to call him and to have this difficult conversation with him. We had a close relationship. We talked almost every day. But even though I had felt these gut fears, I had never really talked to him about suicide. So that night when we got on the phone together, I could just feel my heart beating out of my chest. I was so nervous about bringing this up, but we had our normal conversation, and when there came a break in our talk, I did it. I went for the plunge and I said, hey, I've been in this training the last couple of days. I know you're down at school, and I know you've really been struggling with depression. And I just don't feel like I would be a good mom if I didn't ask you, have you had thoughts of suicide? Now, let me ask all of you. I got the question out, and that was hard. But was that the hardest part? The hardest part was yet to come. It was kind of in that moment of waiting for his answer and then hearing his answer. And what he said to me, he said, Mom, I have thought about suicide. He said, I'm not thinking about it right now, and I don't know if I could do that to you and the rest of the family. Now, was that the ideal answer? What I wanted to hear as a mom is that he would never have thought about that, and he promised that he never, ever would. But he was vulnerable, and he was honest with me. He told me that he had, and certainly it told me as a mom that I wasn't done asking this question with him. But what I'll never forget is what he said to me after he got that out, after he told me that he was not in immediate danger, but he had been having thoughts of suicide. He said, Mom, thank you for asking me. And what I can tell you is that just asking that question let him know that I cared enough about him to go there, to have that very hard question, to get in that very vulnerable space, out of a space of love and care of caring for him. And I can say over the last decade, we've had this conversation many times. Depression is still a struggle for him, but he isn't suicidal anymore. He has got help in several forms, but he knows that that is something that we can talk about at any point. And I also want to point out here too that it might not always be what your mind thinks is the stereotypical person that may be feeling suicidal. I thought the timing was really unique, but just last night I had a friend come over to my home telling me about suicidal thoughts that she'd been having the day before. And she is not somebody that from the outside, with the way that she portrays her life and the way she's of help to other people, that anybody would ever think that of her. So it's important that we tune in and really pay attention to how a person might be feeling on the inside, and be brave enough to ask some of these really difficult questions. To close up this part, I want to share this quote, that being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. Social support is the most powerful protection against becoming overwhelmed by stress and trauma. Social support is not the same as merely being in the presence of others. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we are held in someone else's mind and heart. So again, that's so important to remember that it's not just being around other people, and certainly in this season of a pandemic where this has been strained for all of us and feeling connected, that there are ways virtually that we can reach out, and if we can't see somebody face to face, even if it's just their foreheads and eyes, that we can let people know that we're connecting to them in a way that we're holding them in our minds and in our hearts. And in that same context, to let those that we care about, that when we can't look on the bright side, that we will sit with them in the dark. And with that, I will turn the time over to Andrea.
Thank you, Heidi, for laying such an excellent foundation and for sharing your personal story. We're going to go on to, sorry.
Andrea, your audio keeps cutting out.
Oh, I have no idea what to do to remedy that, to be honest. Do you want me to, if it continues to be a problem, I could try disconnecting my headset.
Just try leaning forward. I think it seems to work better.
That's very strange. Is that working okay? All right, well. Helpful to give that person an opportunity to discuss the story of how they got to this point in their life. So I've heard it kind of described by somebody who's experienced this, that the thoughts of suicide and that rumination and that emotional pain and suffering can.
Andrew, your audio is going out again. I wonder, maybe turn off your video just in case it's a bandwidth issue.
You know what? I'm going to go ahead and try unmuting my, or try taking off my headset.
Good idea.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that little delay. Well, let me know. Oh yeah, so I was supposed to mention that you can put questions into the chat. And we are happy to address them as we see them or at the end. Okay, so sound still good? Okay, great, I'll continue then. Okay, so I've heard an example given that the pain and pressure and discomfort associated with suicidal thoughts and ruminations around suicide can be like filling up a balloon, right? That that the pressure and the pain is building, and that talking about suicide really openly, talking about reasons for wanting to die, talking about the pain that you've been feeling can be like releasing some of that air in the balloon. And so we're going to really try our very best after someone discloses these thoughts of suicide with us to slow ourselves down. It's a very natural response to feel, uncomfortable, to feel anxious. But we're going to just try to take a breath and slow ourselves down and really focus on listening to them and to their story. And this also, as a side note, gives us a really helpful opportunity to get some clues about what they've already tried to feel better, what's worked or hasn't worked in the past, and what some of their protective factors or life preservers could be that we can draw upon later in the conversation. So after we spend some time really just hearing them and validating what they're going through, then we can move to getting some help. And so one way to do this is to say, can we call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline together? And we'll give you that phone number, I think, on the next slide. So I'm not sure what to do next, but I know they can help us. And this is a fantastic resource because if you can call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline with that person at risk, then what happens when you call is you can get a full crisis evaluation right then and there with the person. They can have the opportunity to get some support and to come up with an action plan that will allow them to keep themselves safe. So this is the Suicide Prevention Lifeline phone number, and it's the 1-800-273-TALK, and I strongly encourage you to put that into your phone right now to have that ready in case you might be in a crisis situation or in a situation where you might need it in the near future. And also the Safe UT app. So the Safe UT app is designed for youth, but it's actually available to all Utahns. And so it gives you the ability to chat with a crisis counselor at any point. And so you would be able to just chat with them directly through the app. And that's better for some of us who don't love talking on the phone very much, especially for young people, but there's many of us that would prefer a chat feature rather than a phone conversation. A third resource that you'd want to put in your phone today and really have available would be the Trevor Project Lifeline. And that is number 3 on this list, and one that provides counseling and crisis support to LGBTQ individuals and their allies. And so that would be those top 3 resources on here, I think, are the most critical for you to be prepared to know how to use today. So after that, we have the My3 app, which allows you to create a safety plan where you kind of just list some supportive persons and some things you can do to feel better and go through that with the person. You could also call 211 or access their local mental health authority, especially if that person does not have access to insurance or is unable to pay for their mental health care. Those resources could be really helpful. And then NAMI Utah, which gives free support groups and classes. So, this this is going to be kind of going into a little bit more detail, and I wanted to just preface this by saying that if you just remember everything, if you're new to suicide prevention, and this is the first time you've heard this information, it's perfectly okay if you just really focus on the information you've already received thus far. That's kind of the real meat and some of the most critical introductory information. But some of you may have been working with members of your congregation already, and you may be experienced in working with individuals at risk of suicide, or you may have some more in-depth questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit more detail that might be helpful. So what do you do if they don't call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline? And because, of course, we want to strike this careful balance at this point between, protecting the safety of that person and doing what we think we need to do to keep them safe, and also respecting their autonomy, because that will, set us up for the most success if we keep those things in balance, and keep both factors present in our mind, coming from a place of compassion and empathy. And so really how we react if that person doesn't want to call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or is kind of resistant to receiving a connection to professional care, it depends on whether that person has a suicide plan or intent to act on these thoughts. So when we're asking about plan, we could ask, have you thought about how you would end your life? Or do you have the means? Have you been, researching ways to end your life? Or we can also ask about intent. Have you had these thoughts and had any intention of acting on them? Or how likely do you think you are to act on these thoughts? So if there's no planning or intent to act on the thoughts, it's perfectly appropriate. They're kind of that earlier stages of suicide ideation. Oh, and by the way, an example of how this may sound might be, I've had thoughts of wanting to die, or I've, just been feeling like I wanted to go to sleep and not wake up. But I can never act on these thoughts because I know how it would impact my family. And so that would be an example of somebody who does have suicide ideation and definitely could benefit from a referral, and some follow-up, but it's not an imminent threat. And so it's okay to refer them to going through their insurance or helping them make a connection to behavioral health care, right? So we would still absolutely refer to a mental health counselor and potentially a primary care physician. We're going to definitely plan a time to check in with them, preferably the next day. And it can also be very helpful here to list some things that the person can do to feel better when upsetting situations or emotions arise. And so you could do this directly in the My3 app, as I mentioned, just help them kind of come up with a list of strategies, specific things they can do on their own to feel better. Like I could, listen to my favorite artist who plays, this calm or uplifting music. That could be one thing. Or I could call my neighbor and we could go take our dogs on a walk. Or I could bake something. That could be a coping skill that we could use on our own to feel better. And then also some strategies or places that they could go to be around others and feel better. So that could be, I could go to, take my kids to the park. Or I could go read in a coffee shop. Just being around other people can sometimes be enough to help change our mood state. And then also listing with them the names of some people that they can talk to for distraction or for help. And you can include yourself on that list of resources. And then finally, some crisis resources that they could use, like Safe UT or the Suicide Prevention Lifeline if things get bad. So these are some strategies you could list, or you could go through with somebody who doesn't necessarily have planning or an intent to act on their thoughts of suicide. So if the person does have any planning or any intention of acting on the thoughts, then it is best to get a professional assessment and intervention that day because the risk may be more imminent. And so this may sound like, if you ask them these questions about, have you thought about how you would end your life, or do you have any intent to act on these thoughts? They might sound like, yes, I have a firearm at home and I've thought about using that. And last week I checked to see if we had bullets. That would be an example of a statement that would show you that their planning is further along and that a professional assessment is really needed. Or I don't know if I'll make it through the weekend. I'm not feeling safe. Or I have some pills that I would take. I was thinking about waiting until my kids go to school and taking them. So those are examples of statements that show planning or some intent to act. And it is really important in those cases to get a professional assessment and intervention that day. And let's go to the next one. We'll address some of those questions at the end. So suicide plan or intent. In that case, they have several options for how they could get some professional care that day. And there are several options you can walk them through and then kind of, respect their autonomy and what they feel would be most appropriate, as long as they're willing to get some kind of help that day, right? And so you could encourage them again to call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline with you together. You could contact the local mental health authority to request a same-day appointment or to request a contact from the mobile crisis outreach team that the local mental health authority has. We could also visit a local emergency department or a behavioral health access center. But it is important to note that often it's best to start with option A or B, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the mobile crisis outreach team, because those resources are free and they're going to be able to provide the same services as far as doing a risk assessment and giving that person a safety plan and a plan for how to move forward. So just something to note. But if the risk is very high, if things are really escalated and that person does not feel safe and would like to access a local emergency department, then that's great. And if you're not able to contact any of these resources with a person at risk, then as a last resort, you have 911, where you can call and request a crisis intervention team officer. And so that's kind of our last resort if the person at risk is unwilling to or unable to access any of these resources. It's also really helpful to ask which family or social supports they would like to involve. So, and you can do that, regardless of the level of risk. That's a helpful and important strategy. So I just kind of broke it down into a flow chart. For those of you who really appreciate visuals, you can see it broken out visually. So there's those thoughts of wanting to die or not wanting to live anymore, and then it shows what actions you would take if they do have planning or intent to act versus if they don't have planning or intent to act. And right here, I just want to tell you one more time that if you're new to suicide prevention and this is seeming overwhelming to you, that's okay. Let's just focus on getting that person connected to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and keeping things simple. And that's your best free 24/7 accessible resource. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, but these are some additional options for you if you would like to, or if the situation warrants it, you can use these as well. So the ideal suicide intervention, you want to really convey compassion and respect for the person. And it's not going to be a one-time conversation. We're going to try to express concern and love in a way that really shows you can get through this and I'm going to be here for you. You don't have to go through this alone, can be a huge relief. And we definitely want to empower the person at risk with the resources and whatever coping skills they might need to get through difficult situations. Because sometimes if we're giving a referral to mental health treatment, it may be, a couple of days before they'll get the first appointment, and it may be several appointments before they really start to see results. And so what crisis resources, what coping skills, what social supports do we have to get through that time? And the end goal is that they walk away from this conversation feeling connected to professional supports and just feeling heard and valued as a person. So there's also been several very high quality studies that have been done that show that even sending a text or a card to a person after you've had this initial conversation, just to say, hey, I'm thinking of you, I hope things are going better now, and I'm here if you need to reach out. Just something very simple like that can by itself save a life, especially for those groups that are less likely to access treatment. We know that some males or other maybe less likely to access help, or some other individuals based off of just our personal, lack of resources or the stigmas we've internalized about mental health care. And that this intervention of sending a caring card, a caring contact, giving a phone call or a text can by itself be really powerful. So I want you to realize that you don't have to be in any given situation alone, that you always have the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that 1-800-273-TALK, as a resource to you, as a helper, that you can turn to them to consult and to just kind of debrief after you've gone through a conversation like this. Sometimes, we walk away feeling like, I'm just worried about this person still. I don't know if I did enough to support them. And this Lifeline resource is always available for you as a helper as well. And so we want to kind of internalize this mantra that we never worry alone. We're always connecting ourselves to support and always connecting that person at risk to support as well. So there may be some instances where we hear back from the person that, I've tried medication before, I've tried talk therapy before, and treatment isn't working for me. And so we need to kind of be prepared to respond to that as well. So first off, I just want to say that sometimes it can take a lot of persistence and patience and trial and error, right, to find the medication or a provider, a therapist that is effective for us. And so you could give an analogy, that if you went to go get your haircut and it turned into this, and the outcome was this horrible botched haircut that was uneven and just looked terrible, would you walk away from that experience saying, well, I guess haircuts just aren't for me? Probably not. You would probably just change hairstylists and find, a haircut, a style, or a hairstylist that was a better fit for you. And so treatment can be the same type of a thing where we have to have persistence and trial and error. Also, we want to make sure we're using our full range of treatment options. For example, medication only is not a sufficient treatment plan for somebody who is at risk of suicide. We need to include other self-help supports and talk therapy as well. So we're going to be giving those referrals. And they could also try a suicide-specific therapy, which are available through the local mental health authorities, or you could search for them online, such as dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, or CAMS. So that could be an option as well. All right, so I'm going to turn the time over to Marissa, and she's going to cover some information about counseling on access to lethal means, which is a brief intervention that could be included in this conversation to help save a life.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. And as Andrea said, I think this is one example of the type of intervention that we know can play a really important role in keeping people safe at these crisis times and ensuring they can get that connection to support that Andrea and Vinay, or Andrea and Heidi rather, mentioned as being so important. So what I want to note is, in opening, is the fact that one of the most powerful risk factors for suicide deaths here in Utah and in the Mountain West is ready availability of highly lethal methods, which in Utah means firearms. And the approach that I'm going to take in explaining this to you, I want you to know that this has been developed with total collaboration with Utah gun groups. They have been crucial partners in this work because we know that firearms are part of so many of our families' heritage and identity here in Utah. And so the idea of lethal means reduction, of putting time and distance between someone who may be high risk for suicide and a highly lethal method like a gun, is not antithetical to Second Amendment rights, but instead actually builds on many of the values of gun safety and friends helping friends that we have learned from our collaborators who are gun advocates and gun owners. So, the important thing to note here is that suicides here in Utah by methods other than firearms, so by hanging, by overdose, by cutting, all of those rates of suicide are not so different from a state like Massachusetts. Where we see an enormous difference in the rate of suicide is when it comes to the method of firearms. And the reason for that is because guns are very much more accessible here in Utah than they are in a place like Massachusetts. And so that particular method of suicide is what accounts for the many, many times difference in the overall rate of suicide here in the Mountain West. So it's not saying guns are the only issue. There's obviously many different risk factors, but when it comes to the number of people who sadly and tragically die by suicide, the numbers when it comes to this particular method really stand alone. And so, as I said, we've been so lucky to work in coalition with such a diverse group, not only health professionals and public health people like you're hearing from today, but veterans, law enforcement, gun groups, and really coming together around a common goal, common vision that no person in suicidal crisis should ever have access to a firearm. And this is not a controversial statement. It's one that we share the most ardent gun supporters alike with those who are non-gun owners. And it really builds on the idea of friends don't let friends drive drunk. Here in the United States, we didn't change social norms around drunk driving by banning cars or by prohibiting alcohol. Instead, we said there are times in all of our lives where we should not have the keys, where we need to take responsibility for asking a friend, you know what, let me drive you home and take the keys. So this is not about a prohibitive strategy, or it is really just about prevention, plain and simple. And so, as I mentioned, firearms are highly lethal and very common. So guns make up the largest proportion, about 51% of suicide deaths here in Utah. And if you look at all gun deaths in the state of Utah, 85% of gun deaths are suicides. The good news is that putting time and distance between a person with a suicidal impulse and a very highly lethal method, a gun, it has been shown in all of the literature and meta reviews to be one of the very most effective ways to prevent suicide. So that's what I'm here to introduce to you today, is this idea of lethal means reduction. And I want to give a quick example of this in action. The country of Israel has mandatory military service for most 18-year-olds and young adults. And Israel was having a major firearm suicide issue in the 1990s. And so they made one simple policy change. When the servicemen and women went on the weekends, when they would go home, because in Israel it's a very small country, you can go home to your city or town on the weekends. They said to those service people, you need to leave your state-issued firearm on base. So just a simple change, leave your gun on base, don't take it home. That simple policy change resulted in a 40% reduction of suicides in the Israeli military. So suicides by other methods didn't change. Suicides during the weekdays didn't change. What led to that 40% reduction was solely putting time and distance between people on the weekends when they're going through a lot of emotions and maybe they're drinking and other activities, and that highly lethal method. And so why does this work? There are basically three reasons, and I'm just going to mention them briefly. The first is that many suicide attempts occur with very little planning during a short-term crisis. We often think of suicides as being something someone ponders for days and weeks and years. And for a small portion of people, that's the case. But when you examine the literature, what we find is that the period of time from when someone decides that they're going to take action to end their life and when they actually take that action is usually minutes. For over 50% of people, it is less than 10 minutes from when they make the decision to when they act. So anything we can do to elongate that period of time and help them get through that brief crisis, that feeling of panic after a relationship is tense or a job is lost, anything we can do to get them safely through that crisis period can help save their life. The second reason lethal means reduction works is that guns are very fatal. So this is a reason a lot of people own guns for hunting or for home protection. When someone attempts suicide using a firearm, they will die at least 90% of the time. It's what we call the case fatality ratio. Compare dying 90% of the time to the other most common methods of attempting suicide, where the case fatality ratio is 2%. So with a gun, the person almost never makes it to the hospital. They die that first attempt. With other methods, they're much, much, much more likely to die. And so guns are really in a league of their own. And so we just have to recognize how important this lethality is when it comes to safety for people at risk. And then the final reason lethal means reduction works is because it's not true that people will just find another way. I've talked to people in emergency departments whom I work with, and they'll say, well, we saved their life from this overdose, but if there's a will, there's a way. It turns out we have a lot of data, about 90 studies on this, and people who survive even a very serious suicide attempt do not go on, 90% of them will not go on to die by suicide later in their life. So what that tells us is that if you can save a life in the short term, you can usually save a life for the long term by suicide. So these brief interventions, this even simple act of safer storage can save a life. So what is the basic storage message? The basic storage message is this, that when we or someone we know is struggling, going through a difficult period, a divorce, a bout of depression, etc., the safest approach is to store guns away from the home during this period of increased risk. If that's not possible, then the next best approach is to store them in a gun safe or a lockbox at home and keep the keys or combination away from the person who is at risk. And so to go into a tiny bit more depth on this, when it comes to off-site storage, that safest approach, here in Utah, our gun laws are very permissive. And so with very few exceptions, you could store your firearms or encourage a neighbor to do so with almost any relative or friend. Unless they have committed a felony or they're on a very narrow restricted persons list, it's very easy to transfer firearms to someone for safe storage, assuming that person's in a good state of mind to be storing them. Some gun stores and gun ranges will offer lockers for storing firearms. A self-storage facility or a pawn shop can be a good approach for some people. And then here in Utah, we have something called the Safe Harbor Law, which allows a gun owner or the gun owner's spouse to voluntarily bring their guns to a police department for safe storage, no questions asked. They just do a background check upon return of the guns. Our only advice there is just to call the police or sheriff's office before dropping them off. But that's called the Safe Harbor Law, and it applies across our state. So those are some off-site storage options. In terms of on-site storage, that second best approach, the important thing here is to ensure all the guns are unloaded and are in a gun safe or a small lockbox. You've probably seen Representative Ellison with his biometric safe, these relatively inexpensive lockboxes that you can keep at the bedside for a self-defense gun and easily access with the push of a few buttons or a fingerprint. So you want to keep the guns unloaded in that safe lockbox or safe. Keep the ammunition ideally stored separately or out of the house altogether. And remember that those cable locks or trigger locks, we give out a lot of them as a state and as health systems. They're better than nothing, but on their own, they're really not adequate. And so you might use them in combination with the safe, but it should be a combined approach. And then finally, if the guns are already locked and maybe I'm the gun owner and I'm worried about myself, I could ask a friend or loved one to change the combination so that I'm not able to access them. One last option, if nothing else, just making the gun inoperable for a brief period of time can be a really better than nothing approach. So removing a critical part of the mechanism, such as the slide or firing pin. The most important thing here is just hiding guns is not safe storage. There's lots of research about this, and let's just say kids and teenagers know where everything is. They know your hiding spot. So hiding guns under the bed or in a closet or something, not adequate. We've talked about guns, but I do, before I close, want to mention that medications are also part of a lethal means reduction strategy. As I mentioned before, fortunately, most medications are not nearly as lethal as firearms, but we still lose far too many loved ones and neighbors to intentional overdose. And so what we advise is that we make sure to properly dispose of outdated or unneeded medications, making sure to really keep only non-lethal necessary quantities on hand. And then, of course, lock up those that are most prone to abuse, addiction, and overdose. So prescription painkillers, anxiety pills, amphetamines, sedatives, and tranquilizers. Those are the big categories. And then finally, before I wrap up, what I've introduced to you today is sort of the basic arguments and components of what we call counseling on access to lethal means. But we hope that those of you, especially those of you who are faith leaders, will learn to engage in these brief conversations with people you care about. It's such an amazing opportunity to save lives. And we actually have an online 1-hour course that trains you in how to have this conversation effectively, respectfully, and in a way that gun owners here in Utah have advised will have the greatest impact on making people feel that they are included and they are, this is a collaborative conversation. So we welcome you to take this online course. I'm actually going to put in the chat right now the exact URL. It's featured on train.org. /Utah, and you can search CALM, and totally free, offers clinical education credit if you happen to be a clinician. And we would love for you to go deeper on some of the basics I've introduced here. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Andrea, and I think she has a few more slides, and then we're going to have a quick closing prayer, followed by hopefully a few questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Marissa. So, and hopefully you guys can hear me okay again this time. So what can we do as religious communities? We wanted to kind of end on this note about how do we create an environment that in our religious faith communities that is supportive, that addresses difficult issues. And so we kind of came up with some of these tips here, and we hope that you'll take them into consideration. So the first one is we can strive to create an environment of hope through love and inclusiveness. And one resource for that is the Family Acceptance Project. And we could even put the link in the chat in a few minutes. But the Family Acceptance Project gives some really concrete tips about how to create an accepting and loving environment for LGBTQ individuals, even in specific faith contexts such as LDS. We could also have open dialogue about difficult issues like suicide and addiction. And it can be incredibly helpful if members of the clergy are willing to talk about their own personal struggles with mental health and to normalize help seeking and share, their own experiences with help seeking. That can be a really powerful thing. Additionally, we can try to support those who struggle with mental illness just as we would support a person with physical illness. And so an example of this would be earlier this year, I came down with a bad case of viral pneumonia, and it was pretty rough. And I was really lucky with my friends and neighbors reaching out to me to get about 4 loaves of homemade bread, which is a ridiculous amount of homemade bread that nobody actually needs, but it was incredibly kind and thoughtful. And it's actually also totally what I was craving at the time. But what do we do for individuals who are hospitalized or unwell because of a mental health condition? Do we have the same tangible kind of outreach that shows our love and concern? And what can we do to make our outreach, more on par with what we would do for a physical illness? Also, we just strongly encourage you to implement activities and strategies that build connection and community. And so how can we check in on individual members of our congregation? An example that I heard from my own faith community recently was that there was an elderly woman in our church that had been really isolating and staying away from other people because of COVID and because of her health, and was trying to protect her health in a way that made sense to her. And when she was visited by a member of our community, she said, the last time I really got out of my house, other than to maybe go get the mail or go on a very short walk, was 2 months ago when somebody drove me around the neighborhood and just took me on a short drive for 20 minutes to go see some sights. And she said it was so nice to just go on a little drive and to see some new things and some new faces. And that was such a nice change of routine. And just hearing that just kind of broke my heart and made me realize that not only was that, that woman being taken on a drive by someone in her neighborhood, not only was that, a really important connection for her, but that also could have been a really important moment of connection for whoever was able to take her on the drive. That really all of us are benefited when we do these kind of one-on-one outreaches and we have a sense of community. And so I encourage you to think about how you can build these one-on-one outreaches within your faith community, and how you can just in general be a community builder in whatever neighborhood, friend group, clergy or faith community that you're in. Starting, social groups or online chat groups is, I hope, going to be one concrete takeaway that you take from this session today. I also just encourage you to have these one-on-one relationships so that you can identify those who are struggling and offer tangible support to those in need.
Oh, are you done, Andrea?
I was going to read this quote. Would you like to
go
read
ahead.
it?
Sorry, I chimed in too soon.
So I was really.
Hey, Steve.
Would you mute so I
turn off the echo?
Thanks. I'm like, I thought I was hearing myself echoing back. Thank you. That's good to know that it wasn't just me. So I was really struck by this quote I wanted to share with you because I know that what we've talked about today could feel a little bit overwhelming to some of you who are new to this topic. And so I want you to focus on just one outreach that you can make today or just one way that you can build connection starting today. And so this quote says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." And we each have some small part to play that we can start today. And so I'd like to thank you for your time and your willingness to do that.
Thank you, Andrea and Heidi and Marissa. That was just so excellent and so worth our time. Just two quick things before we let Pastor Logan Wolf wrap things up with a prayer. One other suggestion that I found helpful is that I've spent a number of Sundays going to different congregations and doing a suicide prevention workshop, which has been warmly received by those congregations that have asked me to do that. There's a lot of people that are willing to do that. They go over some of the same basic concepts that were discussed today. And so just think about that as another option in your toolbox. Following up on what Marissa said, I bring a big box of trigger locks with me and talk about the same things that Marissa did. I'll do this with the adults. If the youth are there, I kind of excuse them and then just speak with the adults. But I tell them that in this box, I have one thing that will take about 5 minutes that could easily save your child's life if done properly. And I'll be giving it away for free at the end. And then I've really grabbed their attention. And then I open the box and explain what it is and tie back to my prior conversations. And I believe we have plenty of those trigger locks available through the state if a congregation desires to distribute those. So again, thank you for all who have participated today. Remind you to fill out the evaluation, and I look forward to having you join us during our next session. And we will let Pastor Logan Wolf from Cross Point Church give our final prayer and reflection. Pastor Wolf. Are you with us, Pastor? Pastor Wolf, are you there?
I think because he's signed in as a participant, he's automatically muted.
Okay. Do we know how to fix that?
Paul, are you able to unmute Logan Wolf?
Logan, are you there? Well, sorry about those technical difficulties. I see that, Travis, I think you have the technical ability, technology-wise. Would you be willing to offer a short prayer for us?
Sure. You may need to mute yourself, Steve, so that we don't get
Done. Thank you.
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the opportunity that we have had together as leaders in our faith to learn and to develop a greater capacity and skills in how to intervene to those who are in deep pain and suffering. And dear Father, we pray for them and that they might find hope and that we might be instruments in helping them find hope in healing of their pain, and pray that we might have courage to minister to those around us, and we might also be able to see and recognize those who are struggling in word and in other signs that we might observe. And we're grateful for Heidi and Andrea and Marissa and for the information that they have shared. Bless them for their efforts. And we pray that we might go forward in faith in ways that we can help protect others. And we do this in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Travis, and all who have participated. Have a wonderful day.